On the surface, nothing much seems to happen when sunlight reaches your skin. You step outside, you feel warmth, maybe a slight brightness on your face. And that is usually the end of the story as far as ordinary experience is concerned. But ordinary experience is a poor guide to physics because some of the most important events in your body are so small, so fast, and so silent that you never notice them at all. At this very moment, a photon that left the sun roughly 8 minutes ago may be arriving at your skin. And the remarkable thing is not that it travels so far, but that it arrives carrying exactly the kind of energy needed to alter matter. I've always liked that about physics. Nature does not make speeches. It does not announce that something important is about to happen. A tiny packet of light reaches a molecule, the numbers line up, and a bond breaks. That is all. No drama in the event itself, and yet consequences begin immediately. In the outer layers of your skin sits a molecule called 7-dehydrocholesterol, placed there by your own biology as part of a very old arrangement between the human body and sunlight. It remains stable until ultraviolet B radiation strikes it with enough energy to disturb one specific part of its structure. When that happens, the bond between carbon 9 and carbon 10 breaks. The ring opens and the molecule changes form. The event is microscopic, but it is not trivial. A different molecular shape means a different future. That is one of the things I find most satisfying about the body. When you look at it closely, it is not merely made of tissue, it is built out of conditional events. If this bond holds, one path remains closed. If that bond breaks, a new sequence becomes available. The body is full of these gates, and light is one of the keys. What makes this especially striking is how absurdly small the beginning is compared to the scale of the outcome. We are not talking about a flood of radiation or some dramatic injury. We are talking about one photon interacting with one molecule in one part of your skin, and yet from that single interaction, chemistry begins to reorganize over the next several hours and days. The altered molecule will be transformed again, moved through the body, modified in other organs, and eventually turned into a biologically active signal that affects tissues far beyond the skin where the story began. The first time I really understood that chain as a physical process rather than a health slogan, it changed the way I thought about being outdoors. Before that, sunlight was just weather. After that, it looked more like input. The skin was not simply being exposed to the environment, it was receiving information in the form of energy and doing what physical systems always do when the right energy arrives. Changing state. There is also something beautifully merciless about it. Your opinion does not matter. Your schedule does not matter. The molecule does not care whether you believe sunlight is important, whether you are busy, whether you are young, or whether you have spent the last 10 years mostly indoors. If the photon arrives, the reaction can occur. If it does not, nothing starts. The body is patient, but chemistry is literal. So beneath the level of feeling, beneath the level of awareness, your skin is a place where light is translated into structure, and structure into function. That translation begins with no sensation you can detect, no visible signal. You can point to just a molecular event taking place quietly in ordinary daylight, which is probably why so many people underestimate it. A factory is not defined by noise, smoke, or moving belts. A factory is any system that takes in raw material, processes it in stages, regulates its output, and produces something the rest of the system depends on. By that definition, your skin is a factory, and sunlight is one of its essential inputs. I do not mean that poetically. I mean it in the plain engineering sense. Once ultraviolet light has altered 7 dehydrocholesterol in your skin, the molecule does not become useful all at once. It first shifts into provitamin D3, then, through ordinary body heat, rearranges again into vitamin D3. Even here, the body is doing something elegant. It does not treat the event as finished when the photon has done its job. It continues processing the product through time. Using temperature itself as part of the mechanism, energy arrives as light, structure changes, and then heat quietly carries the molecule forward into its next form. From there, the molecule enters circulation and heads to the liver, where it is modified again, then to the kidneys, where a second modification turns it into calcitriol, the active hormonal form. This is the point where the name vitamin starts to become misleading. People hear vitamin D and think of something dietary, something optional, something mild. But calcitriol behaves less like a vitamin and more like an instruction signal. It enters cells, crosses into the nucleus, binds to receptors associated with DNA, and helps determine which genes are expressed. That is not decorative biology. That is control architecture. Calcium absorption in the gut, phosphorus handling in the kidneys, mineral balance in bone, immune cell behavior, and cellular growth regulation all depend in part on signals downstream of this pathway. A photon touches the skin, and days later gene activity is different. If you wrote that into a novel, some people would think it was too tidy, but that is exactly what the chemistry does. What interests me here is not only the pathway itself, but the design logic. The system is not careless. It does not keep producing indefinitely just because light continues to arrive once enough precursor accumulates. Excess ultraviolet exposure begins converting it into inactive byproducts rather than endlessly increasing active output. That means the factory contains its own restraint. It was built for natural exposure patterns, not unlimited production. And that brings in the modern problem because the machinery is still there. But the operating conditions have changed. For most of human history, people did not need reminders to encounter sunlight. They worked outdoors, walked outdoors, spoke outdoors, waited outdoors, grew up outdoors. Now, much of life takes place under ceilings, behind glass, inside vehicles, under artificial illumination that may be good enough for reading a label or climbing stairs, but has very little to do with the environment this pathway developed to expect. I do not think this is mainly a story about neglect. It is more often a story about drift. A person does not usually decide to deprive the system. Life simply narrows. Work moves inside. Travel becomes seated. Age reduces range. Knees ache. Friends move away. Days become organized around convenience. Then caution. Then abid. And because the decline is gradual, the deficit does not feel like an event. It feels like normal life. That is what makes it easy to miss. The body may remain fully capable of carrying out the chemistry, while the trigger becomes less frequent year by year. Nothing announces the change. The factory is intact. The workforce is present. The regulatory machinery still functions, and yet output falls because the raw material does not arrive often enough. Seen that way, deficiency is not mysterious at all. It is what any factory produces when demand remains, but supply grows thin. If I lock you in a room with no windows, no clock, no sunrise, no sunset, and no way of telling morning from evening, your body will still try to keep time. That fact alone is interesting. But what is even more interesting is that it does not keep perfect time. Left to itself, the human circadian system drifts slightly. which means the body needs a daily correction from the outside world. That correcting signal is light. Most people think the eye is a device for making images, and of course it is, but that is not the whole job. Buried in the retina are specialized cells that do not exist to help you recognize faces or read words. They respond to light, especially in the blue range, and send their signals along a pathway that leads not to the visual centers of the brain, but to a small structure in the hypothalamus known as the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The master circadian clock, that tiny cluster, helps coordinate when you become alert, when your body temperature rises and falls, when hormones are released, when you grow sleepy, and when sleep becomes deep enough to do its restorative work. So the eye is doing two very different things at once. One system gives you a picture of the world. Another system tells your brain what time the world is. You can see perfectly well and still fail to deliver the timing signal strongly enough. That is a distinction people often miss. Indoor life makes the problem worse because the clock does not respond mainly to what feels bright by household standards. It responds to a much stronger environmental cue. Typical indoor lighting may be sufficient for comfort and function, but compared with outdoor light, even outdoor shade, it is surprisingly weak. The body's timing system evolved under a sky, not under bulbs. It was calibrated by daylight. Intensity changes far beyond what most indoor environments provide. This matters because circadian timing is not a decorative extra. When the signal weakens, the whole rhythm flattens. Morning alertness becomes less decisive. Evening sleepiness becomes less well-timed. People begin waking too early, feeling drowsy at odd hours, or never feeling fully awake during the day. They often describe this as a sleep problem, which is true, but it is also a timing problem. The system has not necessarily forgotten how to sleep. It is no longer being synchronized with enough force. Age complicates this further. The lens of the eye gradually yellows over time, which reduces the transmission of short wavelength light, precisely the kind these retinal cells are, especially responsive to. At the same time, older adults often spend less time outdoors, whether because of mobility, routine, whether or caution. So the signal is weakened twice, fewer photons are available, and a smaller fraction of those photons reaches the cells that matter for circadian entrainment. The clock then runs with less contrast, less stability, and less amplitude. I find there is something almost mechanical about that decline, and I do not mean that coldly. In fact, I find it reassuring. If a system weakens because its input weakens, then the deterioration is not always some mysterious verdict delivered by aid. Sometimes it is the predictable behavior of a timing device receiving a poorer signal than it used to. That does not solve every sleep problem, and it would be silly to pretend it does. But it does place part of the problem back in the realm of physics, where causes are often clearer than they first appear. So when sleep begins to fragment and days begin to blur at the edges, the change may not be happening only in the mind or only in the night. It may begin much earlier in the ordinary morning light that reaches the eye, or fails to. Mood is one of those things people talk about as if it floats above the machinery, as if it belongs to some separate, misty layer of human life untouched by physics. And I have never been able to take that idea seriously. Because the moment you look closely enough, the mystery does not disappear, but it does acquire structure. And one of the clearest examples is the way light entering your eyes changes the chemistry of your brain in ways that are measurable, repeatable, and far less sentimental than the language we usually use to describe feeling. The same retinal cells that help set your circadian clock also send signals into pathways that influence serotonin production, and that matters because serotonin is not some vague happiness essence sprinkled over the brain. When life goes well, it is a neurotransmitter involved in mood regulation, energy, emotional resilience, and the biochemical chain that eventually contributes to melatonin production at night. In other words, the same daylight that tells your brain what time it is also helps determine how much raw material is available for one of the chemical systems most closely tied to how steady, alert, and emotionally functional you feel. That is already interesting. But the part I really like is that this relationship has been measured in a very direct way. Researchers have looked at serotonin turnover in relation to bright light exposure and found that more light corresponds to more serotonin activity. That means when you step outside into strong daylight, something more specific is happening than a vague sense of refreshment. Photons are striking the retina. The retina is sending a signal, and the brain is responding chemically. The feeling, if it comes, is not separate from the mechanism. The feeling is what the mechanism is like from the inside. People often say they feel off after spending too many days indoors, especially in winter. And I think that phrase is often more accurate than the speaker realizes. Off is what a system feels like when several inputs are running below threshold without failing dramatically enough to earn a diagnosis. Lower light exposure during the day can mean weaker serotonin signaling, weaker circadian entrainment, weaker melatonin production at night, and then poorer sleep, lower energy the next day, and less desire to go outside again. It becomes a downward spiral so ordinary that many people mistake it for personality or age or the unavoidable heaviness of modern life. Winter makes the pattern easier to see because the reduction in daylight is external and obvious. In high latitudes, the sun rises late, stays low, and disappears early. And what reaches the eye is not just shorter in duration, but often poorer in intensity. Especially if most of the day is spent indoors, under those conditions, it is not at all surprising that some people develop seasonal mood changes. In fact, I would be more surprised if a light-dependent system failed to respond to a long-term reduction in light. The strange thing is not that mood drops in winter. The strange thing is that people are still sometimes encouraged to think of that drop as though it were detached from the environment. I once noticed, during a period of long indoor work, that the day seemed to have no edges. Morning did not feel like a real beginning. Evening did not feel earned. And the hours in between had a flattened quality to them, as though the whole day had been ironed out. That sensation is hard to describe unless you have felt it. But once I began to pay attention to outdoor light instead of merely indoor brightness, it stopped seeming psychological in the loose sense and started seeming conditional. The machinery had not become poetic. It had become underexposed. That is why bright light therapy works for some people in winter. It is not a trick of suggestion. It is a substitute input. If the sky is not delivering enough signal, an artificial source can partially restore it. Not perfectly, not romantically, but functionally. That distinction matters. The goal is not to imitate the beauty of morning. The goal is to provide the brain with enough light to do what it already knows how to do. So when a bright day feels different from a dim one, that difference does not need to be dressed up as intuition. There is nothing lesser about saying it plainly. The eye receives more light, the brain shifts its chemistry, and the day is lived under different internal conditions. Sometimes the most human explanation is also the most physical. If I told you that part of your blood pressure regulation depends on a gas being stored in your skin and released by sunlight, it would sound like the sort of claim people make when they have become far too enthusiastic about health science and have forgotten the difference between evidence and performance But this one happens to be true, which is why I enjoy it so much. It has that rare quality. Good science sometimes has, where the first reaction is skepticism, and the second, if you follow the mechanism carefully enough, is a kind of reluctant admiration. Your skin does not merely shield the inside from the outside. It stores chemically related forms of nitric oxide in compounds that can be mobilized under the right conditions. When ultraviolet A light penetrates the skin, it can trigger the release of nitric oxide from these reservoirs, allowing that gas to diffuse into the bloodstream and affect the smooth muscle in the walls of blood vessels. The result is vasodilation. The vessels relax, resistance falls, and blood pressure drops. No metaphor is needed. The system is literal. What I like about this mechanism is that it ruins a lazy way of thinking about the skin. People often imagine skin as packaging, useful mainly because it keeps the important organs from spilling out and protects them from the environment. But if exposure to light can change vascular tone through chemistry initiated in the skin itself, then the skin is participating in regulation. Not merely protection. It is not a wrapper. It is an active interface. It receives energy, stores precursors, releases signals, and influences circulation in real time. There is also a certain mischief in the fact that this pathway is independent of vitamin D. Many people have heard, at least vaguely, that sunlight helps with vitamin D, but they have never been told that sunlight also affects cardiovascular function through an entirely different route. That matters because it means you cannot reduce the whole question of sunlight to a supplement bottle, even if you replace one downstream product orally. You have not recreated every process that natural exposure can trigger. Biology is not usually that easily cheated. I remember being struck by how ordinary the implication was. A person goes outside. Sunlight reaches the skin. Arteries relax slightly. Blood pressure changes. And the person experiences none of the drama of it. No one feels the nitric oxide being released. No one announces, my dermal photochemistry is now modulating vascular resistance. The event passes beneath awareness. And perhaps that is why it is so often neglected. Human beings are much more impressed by what hurts than by what quietly helps. Of course, the topic becomes more serious when you connect it to aging. A very large number of older adults live with elevated blood pressure, and many of them spend less time outdoors than they once did. That combination is easy to produce and hard to notice. The days become more indoor, the body less exposed to bright light, the routines narrower, and yet the cardiovascular system continues to operate under the assumption that it evolved in an environment where sunlight would regularly reach the skin, remove a recurring input from a regulatory system, and you should not be surprised if the system behaves differently. None of this means sunlight is a magic treatment or that hypertension can be reduced to one missing variable. Real physiology is messier than that. And anyone promising a single elegant answer to a broad medical problem is usually about 2 steps away from nonsense. But it does mean something more modest and, to my mind, more useful. The environment is part of the physiology. Light is not merely scenery. It is one of the conditions under which the body conducts its normal business. That is the point I keep coming back to. The body is full of systems that make sense only if you imagine them in the world they were built to inhabit. Once you do that, sunlight stops looking like an optional extra and starts looking like part of the operating environment. Something the system quietly expects, even when modern life does not. The trouble with sunlight, and also the reason any honest discussion of it has to be careful, is that the same radiation capable of setting useful biology in motion is also capable of damaging the very tissue it passes through. That is not a contradiction. It is the central fact The photon does not arrive wearing a label that says beneficial or harmful. It arrives carrying energy, and energy can be used, misused, redirected, or absorbed by structures you would rather keep intact. The outcome depends on what is hit, how much arrives, and how often the system has to repair the damage. Ultraviolet light can produce lesions in DNA, including the kinds of abnormal bonds that force repair machinery to step in and cut out damaged segments before mutations accumulate. Your cells are not helpless in the face of this. They are equipped with repair systems that run constantly, identifying problems, excising them, rebuilding the strand from the intact template. That work is going on all the time, and it is one of the least appreciated examples of silent competence in the body. But competence is not infinity. Repair has limits, and with repeated excess exposure, damage can outpace correction. That is why skin cancer risk is real. It is not propaganda, and it is not canceled by the fact that sunlight also supports essential physiology. The interesting question, then, is not whether sunlight is good or bad in some childish absolute sense. The question is, what dose allows the body to use the signal without overwhelming the repair capacity? And here the story becomes much less ideological and much more practical. Moderate exposure can be enough to drive vitamin D production, support circadian timing through the eyes, stimulate the mood-related pathways associated with daytime light, and release nitric oxide from the skin, all without requiring the kind of prolonged overexposure that makes damage accumulate unnecessarily. The body is not asking for endless punishment. It is asking for enough input to run the systems built around that input. The downstream consequences of receiving too little are not abstract. Without adequate active vitamin D signaling, calcium absorption in the gut falls. And when calcium intake cannot support the body's ongoing needs, the skeleton becomes the reserve that gets raided. Bone density declines slowly enough to hide for years, and then suddenly becomes visible in the form of fragility. A fracture in older age is never just a broken structure. It can begin a whole cascade of immobility, infection, deconditioning, and loss of independence. That is what makes the physics feel so close to daily life. A missing environmental input does not remain environmental for long. It becomes mechanical weakness in a human life. Muscle is involved too. Vitamin D receptors are present in muscle tissue, and deficiency is associated not only with weaker bones, but with poor neuromuscular function, worse balance, and a higher risk of falling. The body is not organized into tidy, isolated departments where light helps one thing, sleep affects another, and mobility belongs to a third. The systems overlap. The same deficiency can make a bone easier to break and a fall more likely to happen. The elegance here is not comforting, but it is real. Then there is immunity. Active vitamin D influences immune signaling and supports antimicrobial functions that help the body respond to pathogens. That does not mean sunlight is a magical shield against illness. And I distrust anyone who talks that way. But it does mean the immune system is one more place where the consequences of indoor living can appear under another name. People notice the winter illnesses. Fewer people ask what has changed in the biological background against which those illnesses arrive. What I find touching in all this is that long before anyone could describe melanopsin, calcitriol, nitric oxide, or DNA repair enzymes, older generations often noticed the pattern anyway. They said people looked pale, slept badly, grew weak indoors, seemed better after time outside. The language was imprecise, but the observations were not foolish. I have a great affection for that kind of ordinary human noticing. It reminds you that science does not invent reality. It clarifies it, so the sensible conclusion is neither fear nor worship. Sunlight is not a miracle, and it is not an enemy. It is part of the environment the body was built to negotiate, useful within limits, costly in excess, and deeply entangled with the long maintenance of a human life